The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Family Violence and its Impact on Foster and Adopted Children, which is being offered as part of the ASAP Post-Conference webinar series that will be held the second Wednesday of each month through April 2016. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping items related to today's webinar. First, you will notice a Zoom Viewer button in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. You can use this button to adjust the size of your webinar screen. Secondly, in the control panel located on the upper right-hand side of your screen, you will see the word Questions listed. You can use the plus and minus button to open or close this box. If you have a question for the presenters, you can enter it here. Time permitting, any questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. And now, I am pleased to introduce our presenters for today's webinar, Deb Hawk-Finley and Kai Mumpfield. Deb serves as a program director of APAC, Alabama Pre-Post Adoption Connections. She has a master's degree in education and social work with broad experience in child and family services. Her background includes work with protective, foster care, and adoption services, adolescent treatment programs, therapeutic foster care programs, hospital and outpatient medical programs. Deb also taught special education in Alabama's public school system for 8 years. She was formerly program director for the Family Finders Project and has been with Children's Aid Society as the APAC program director for 10 years. Kai has worked with Children's Aid Society for the past 5 years and currently serves as a Southern Regional Coordinator as well as the Permanency Conference Coordinator for the Alabama Pre-Post Adoption Connections Program. Kai leads life skills and character development programs for local community youth groups and is active in other volunteer opportunities. Although her experience includes direct service and administration, her passion lies within the youth population. Her community involvement, coupled with her work in therapeutic foster care, HIV and AIDS education, and advocacy in foster care adoption, provides her a wide knowledge base that she uses to educate and empower others. Deb and Kai, thank you for taking the time to share with us today. Welcome.
Thanks, Nicole. Hello, I'm Deb Finley, and I will be co-lead with Kai Mumpfield. I'll start, and Kai will pick up, and then we'll rotate. Let me go ahead and get it out of my system. Happy New Year from the National College Football Champions. All right, I did it. So we'll go ahead and mark this training. All right, so our training today is Family Violence and the Impact on Foster and Adopted Children. Before we get into that, we want to just share a little bit of APAC. It is it's a program of Children's Aid Society. It's a collaborative effort between DHR and Children's Aid, and it was formed in 2001. It was created to provide education and support to adoptive families. It is a statewide program. Most of the services are free and available to all adoptive families regardless of how the adoption occurred. This is a slide showing the listing of all of our services. I won't go into that, but as you can see, it's a pretty broad range of services. We're very proud of those. I would suggest that you visit our website. It's listed on the slide to find out a little more about that, or you're certainly welcome to call us. The topic of domestic violence is what we are looking at today, and we have a lot to cover on the effects of domestic violence and complex trauma, along with the strategies to promote positive parenting to help children heal. So any good study starts with a good definition of the problem. So our definition that we're using for family violence, domestic violence, is any abusive, violent, coercive, forceful, or threatening act or word inflicted by one member of a family or household on another. Domestic violence often refers to violence between married or cohabitating couples, but it can also refer to violence against other household members like children or elderly relatives. 3 to 10 million children and teens are exposed to family violence each year. Children who are exposed to domestic violence are 15 times more likely to be physically and or sexually abused. Now Connie will pick up and share more about how domestic violence affects children.
One of the things we wanted to make sure, a lot of times we hear the idea or the concept of, they were just witnesses, or they only heard the violence, they didn't see the violence. And what we wanted to bring out is just recognizing that children are not just witnesses, which minimizes their role and the impact it has on them, but also understanding that they're not passive in this situation, but they are children who are living with the conflict, living with the abuse, and they're actively interpreting, predicting, assessing their roles, and they are actively involved in the domestic violence that happens within the home, and so we can't minimize their exposure to or the impact that it's having on that. And we know this is the case because of the roles children play. Some of the roles we see children play are listed above, and I'll just point out a few of them for you. Because again, we want to recognize they're not just witnesses, again, which minimizes their impact, but that they're actively engaged in those situations. Some of these roles may be roles that are imposed on the child from a particular member of the family, or they may be roles that the child has taken on or assumed themselves. Like the perfect child. This is the child who tries to prevent violence by actively, excelling in school, never arguing, trying to be the good child, as we see the perfect child. We'll see the abuser's confidant, which is sometimes hard to wrap our minds around, because this is a child who's treated better by the abuser, and most likely, to be told that the justifications for the abuse are against the mother, and that child buys into the stories that they're told and found to be the confidant of the particular abuser. And then we have the child who's a scapegoat, and that's the child who's blamed for the scenario and the things that are happening at home. They're the cause for the family problems, and they're the cause for the tension between the parents. If you would just do X, Y, and Z, and this is not just from the parents' view, but also from the siblings and those, from the outside maybe looking in. If Susie would just do better, then this wouldn't be happening. So we, again, recognize that children aren't just witnesses, but they have active roles in what happens in the home, particularly when we're talking about domestic violence. And because children are not just witnesses to the events, but they're playing that active role, they're being impacted by their violence in many, many different ways. And their exposure to violence shapes their values, it shapes how they see others, and it shapes how they see the world. Some of those lessons that we see children learn is that violence and threats are the way that you get what you want. They've seen in the family where the abuser, and we will note here for the purpose of this conversation, we are generally talking about violence from a man to a woman, but violence can look, any form. It could be male on male, female on female. Female could be the aggressor, but again, just for the conversation today, we're specifically we'll be using the inference of male to female violence. But they see that, when I get angry, that it's the victim's fault. If you would have just had my dinner ready when I got home, this wouldn't have happened. And so we see, again, children learning the lesson, the unhealthy lessons, that victims are to blame for the violence. And they see that anger causes violence, or drinking causes violence, because we know a lot of times drinking is associated with those violent situations. We see unhealthy lessons about relationships. They recognize or learn that a person has two choices, to either be the aggressor or the victim. And so we see that aggression becoming more prevalent in young people who have come from homes with domestic violence. Or they learn that anger should be suppressed because it can get out of control, so they don't acknowledge or recognize feelings and don't call them for what they are. So they try to hold it in, and then you have these massive explosive outbursts from children. They see that men are in charge and get to control women's lives, that the women don't have any say-so in what's happening. They don't have the right to be treated with respect. There's a great book, Little Eyes, Little Ears, How Violence Against Mothers Shapes Children as They Grow, that you can check out. It is by Cunningham and Baker. It's a great reference just about, again, the messages that children are learning in homes where domestic violence is prevalent. We also want to talk about the short-term effects of violence on children. We know domestic violence can affect children in several areas, and we see several different domains here, from emotional to social to physical, and etc. But these effects can also be seen as survival strategies. I've mentioned before that children learn behaviors by what they see, by what they're exposed to. And so some of these behaviors can be seen as survival strategies in a home where domestic violence has been prevalent. They learn to withdraw in order to protect themselves by laying low, or they become aggressive in order to protect themselves. Or lying may be an adaptive behavior in order to keep the mother or the sibling safe. And we recognize that some of these behaviors can be externalized or internalized. Some of those external behaviors can be the irritability, the anger and the rage, with the internalized behaviors being withdrawn, dissociation, lethargy. And so again, we recognize that there's a lot more happening, and kids aren't just witnesses to domestic violence, but they are actively being involved in and impacted by what's happening in the home. And then there's some long-term effects, generational violence. What we know is that when we have children who are exposed to violence, that's one of the single best predictors of children themselves becoming a perpetrator of victims later on in life. And we see those cycles within families where, dad was abusive and granddad may have been abusive, and now the young son has, is showing abusive tendencies, anger outbursts, aggression towards others and animals. Substance abuse is another big one. Child abuse, a child exposure to a father abusing mother, again, that's a strong risk factor for the child themselves. Early pregnancy and adolescence, we see young girls looking for love and for affection and for acceptance, and males and wanting to get it right where they may not have seen that happen before in their family. And so early adolescent pregnancy. And then the pro-violence attitudes, again, we talked about learning that anger and aggression are ways to get what you want, and being violent are ways to get what you want. And so we see those pro-violence attitude among children who come from homes with domestic violence. So now we want to look at, and we'll roll over to Deb, who's going to ask this question here before you.
Okay, let's do a poll. Get y'all participating here. What factors impact how a child reacts to domestic violence? All right, so the poll is going to give you 4 choices, and I want you to check the ones that you think make children react differently to family violence. Let's see. The poll's open. All right, so your choices are types of violence, affect personality, age of child, and gender of child. So we'll give you a few minutes if you'll put in your votes. Okay, I see some of you voting, and we're going to close it out in a couple of seconds. Okay, all right, we're going to close it out. So we'll share those results with you. All right, so this is what you're saying. 44% feel like the type of the violence has a big impact on how it affects the child. About a fourth of you feel like personality and age of child have a lot to do with the impact, and then just 6% for gender of child. So, all right, well, let's look at what some research tells us then, and thanks for participating in that. All right, so as for mitigating factors, here are some of the things that we've learned. Children who witness frequent and severe forms of violence, or who don't see their caretakers resolve conflict, will likely have more distress than those who have fewer incidences of physical violence, and then and see more positive interactions with their caregivers. Related to the age of the child, younger children appear to exhibit higher levels of distress emotionally and psychologically than the older children, and we really could attribute that to the older child has more developed cognitive abilities, so they can better understand what's going on, understand the violence, and maybe even have better skills at coping strategies to deal with that. Personality or other protective factors that a child might have. A child's social competence, intelligence, a high self-esteem, an outgoing temperament, strong sibling and peer relationships, and a supportive relationship with an adult, especially a non-abusive parent. All those can help protect the child from some of the adverse effects of exposure. Gender of child. In general, and this is a generality, but in general, boys tend to exhibit more externalized behaviors, such as aggression or acting out, and girls tend to exhibit more internalized behaviors, such as withdrawal or depression. And not surprisingly, children who witness domestic violence and are also physically abused themselves are at higher risk for emotional and psychological maladjustment than those who witness the violence but are not abused. Okay, so in homes where domestic violence exists, kids are much more likely to experience other forms of maltreatment which result in complex trauma. So what is complex trauma? It's exposure to multiple traumatic events that are severe and pervasive, such as abuse or profound neglect. It usually begins early in life, and it can disrupt normal development and even the formation of a self. Since the events often occur in context of a child's relationship with their caregiver, they interfere with the child's ability to form a secure attachment bond. All right, and this is just a visual of the multiple types of trauma that can be experienced and can lead to complex trauma. Isolated, these individual traumas are difficult enough, but when two or more are experienced in a childhood, the trauma becomes more complex. All right, Kay.
This is one of the areas where we want to spend a little bit more time just talking about complex trauma. This is also where this is not just for children who've experienced domestic violence, have been in homes with domestic violence, but any child who has faced trauma, who has been exposed to traumatic events and experiences in their life. So this is applicable across the board. As Deb mentioned, complex trauma is pervasive, and that's one of those words that I think, you know, we have to kind of really think about and look at, and this iceberg kind of helps us to put that into context, because pervasive means it permeates every part of us. So we see here this iceberg, and what we know about an iceberg is only 10% of the iceberg is what we see on the surface. The other 90% is beneath the water. It's hidden by, you know, that water. Everything else up under is where the major piece of the iceberg really is. And complex trauma is like that, in that it results in behavior and emotional manifestations across several domains. The observable behaviors that we see in children are a reflection of what's going on under the surface. So again, 10% on top, 90% beneath. So the 10% that we see in behaviors is just that 10%, but 90% is what's happening, what has affected them, what have they been exposed to, the experiences that they have gone through. One of the people who we refer to a lot, and have some of those resources in our resource library, is Brian Post, who talks about the 4 levels of memory, being cognitive, emotional, motor, and state. And at state level memories, again, one of those pieces in that 90%, which is the most early form of memory, is our early childhood memories, and this is where trauma is buried, and that's the area where the work is really done. And so we want to talk about just some of the effects of complex trauma on children. Again, not just children in homes with domestic violence, but children who have been exposed to and who have experienced trauma in general. So we'll start with attachment and relationships. As Deb mentioned, a lot of times this trauma is found in the context of early relationships with our parents, with our caregivers, with family members. And when our primary caregivers exploit or abuse a child, or again is present a situation where they're growing up in a home with violence, that child learns that he or she is bad and that the world is a terrible place. So we see these difficulties in romantic relationships. We see problems with authority figures, and their ability to develop healthy relationships with friends and significant others depends on us first having those, steady and stable relationships with those of our families. The other piece of this is talking about the state level memory complex trauma, is that our brain's response to threats. and how it stores those traumatic memories and how it's altered by those traumatic experiences. And that looks from our physical to our emotion, which are the other effects that we'll get into. And all those experiences change our brain. Whether they're good experiences like piano lessons or blowing bubbles or having fun at the park, or those negative experiences like living through a tornado or family violence. And that our brain is designed to change in response to those. And so we see some of these other effects playing out through our physical health, from body dysregulation to the chronic physical complaints. When a child grows up and is afraid or under constant or extreme stress, we recognize that that extreme stress, the release of that adrenaline and those stress hormones impacts our immune system. So children with complex trauma histories can develop chronic or recurrent physical complaints such as headaches and stomach aches, so those somatic complaints that we see in our children. As well, adults with histories of trauma have been shown to show more chronic physical conditions. And we've seen this, and hopefully you've heard about this with the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that Kaiser Permanente did, and that's reflective of what we're talking about here, that those adverse experiences affect our physical health. It leads to risky behaviors that can compromise, our health conditions, from smoking to substance abuse to diet and exercise and obesity. So again, this is just a reflection of what we're seeing in research, and that's come out. Also, our emotional health. What we know is 7% of children who've experienced complex trauma will also have a clinical diagnosis. And how many of the kids that we're working with have some clinical diagnoses? And it could be anything from the PTSD and ADHD to bipolar to oppositional defiant disorder. And, we can go down the list here. But what we have to be conscious of is the trauma, and again, at 90% of the iceberg, and dealing with those other effects from complex trauma. Children who have experienced that complex trauma often have difficulty identifying and expressing their emotions. Again, we talked about the anger and how that can be very explosive, and seeing where kids have a limited language for feeling and for their states, being able to say, I'm sad, or I'm upset, or I'm angry, or I'm happy. We also recognize that for children with complex trauma histories, those reminders may be everywhere in the environment, and so it can look like just a kid flying off the handle, with no warning, but there could have been some trigger in the environment that we may not have been aware of, and so that child may react often powerfully, having difficulty calming down when they're upset, or they can internalize those behaviors, as we talked about before, with the disassociation, or externalize it with anger and aggression and rage. The last piece we want to mention about the effects of trauma will include self-concept and future orientation, which is where the real work is. This place is where we live in hope, where we live feelings of worthlessness, where children who've been abused and neglected may feel worthless, like, what's the purpose in trusting people? What's the purpose in going on? We want our children to be able to plan for a future, but it's hard to do when there doesn't seem to be a future before us. And that requires, like I said, a sense of hope, sense of control, and ability to see how your actions have meaning and value, how you yourself have meaning and value. And when they've not lived in an environment where that has been ingrained in them, that's hard to do. And children surrounded by violence, learn at an early age they can't trust people, that the world is not safe, that they're powerless, and that's not the message we want our kids to have. And this message diminishes their sense of competency. It makes them, again, feel powerless and damaged. And these negative expectations interfere with positive problem solving. It leads them to having problems thinking clearly, to reasoning, problem solving, and then being able to plan ahead again, which is where we want them to go from there. One of the things that we've got in the habit of saying around here is it's not about that you're bad, but it's about what has happened to you, and that's where the work is, because it's not it's not that they don't have a future, they don't have a hope, but there's some things that have happened to you that we've got to process through now. So we just see these across the board, from, again, attachment relationship to physical health to emotional impact and the self-concept, and how each of those build on one another and affect, again, our ability to be able to work with the young people who come into our offices or into our homes. So we move with the question or the statement to you. Again, we reference Brian Post as one of the clinicians who we refer to with the Great Behavior Breakdown and some of his other works. But he says, if all we do is focus have become consumed with diminishing, reducing, changing, controlling, suppressing the behavior, then what we're going to be doing is ignoring everything underneath it. Behaviors are a communication of an emotional state, and if we simply address the behavior, we miss the opportunity to really help children heal. And we have to meet young people where they are in order to create that safety. And that happens with our relationship with them. So our challenge is to move from trying to control them and into being connected in order to influence them. And so again, we want to be conscious of addressing that trauma and recognizing that it's about not controlling but having that influence. So at this point, we're going to go into the next slide, and then there's a little vignette here, and we're going to open another poll for you. And I'll read the vignette to you as you take a few seconds to read it yourself. It looks kind of lengthy, but it's a little short vignette. Reese has been in foster care for 20 months after being removed from his biological parents. He has recently been placed in an adoptive home and becomes angry easily and will destroy his and others' property. He frequently challenges the authority of his adoptive mother and is quick to point out when she makes a mistake. His adoptive mother states that Reese can go from 0 to rage in under 10 seconds. Reese has very few friends and has difficulty adjusting to new school. He often falls asleep in class and complains of difficulty sleeping at night. What are some of the indicators that Reese may have come from a history of domestic violence? And I see you all already checking your answers, which is great. And we'll go ahead and close the poll.
Okay.
So your choices was, some of the indicators could be that he has a few friends. He challenges the authority of his adoptive mother. She points out when he makes mistakes, complains of difficulty sleeping at night. And it looks like 71% went with has a few friends. All of you all felt like the challenges with authority was one of the indicators. About half of you said point out when his adoptive mother makes mistakes, and about 71% noted complaints of difficulty sleeping at night. And you were able to, choose as many as you felt were applicable. And all of these are correct. Again, from having a few friends to challenging authority, again, these are the lessons. We talked about those unhealthy lessons that children learn in the home. Challenging the authority. We've seen, again, in homes where domestic violence has been present, where the women have been made to feel like they don't have a right to ask questions, or they don't have any authority in their home. And then the somatic complaints, we just talked about those physical components of it. And so these are some of the challenges that we know that we deal with and we face when working with kids who come from a background with this type of history.
Okay, so now how do we help these children heal? Resilience. So in order for children to overcome their painful past, they must become resilient. And so what is it? So we're considering it the ability to become strong, healthy, or successful again after something bad happens. Some children are more resilient than others just because of their temperament. There's many factors that impact a child's resilience. It is natural, we all have it, but we have to create an environment to allow children to access their natural resilience. Keep in mind that for many children removed from their original families, chaos and violence have been part of their original state. So as a result, they might attempt to recreate that environment and in homes that they go to that are not chaotic and violent. So we've divided protective factors that promote resilience into 3 main areas: individual, family, and community. As you look at these, you can imagine that for the children in care, a lot of these factors are not even in their control and are not consistently present. So the task of promoting resilience can be even harder for children that are fostered or adopted from foster care. As for individual factors, again, a child's temperament, personality, cognitive capacities may allow for greater resiliency, as well as their ability to form relationships with peers. Additional ways to promote resilience might be providing a child opportunities to experience mastery, in other words, to feel some control of his world and to increase his self-esteem. Hobbies of any interest, sports, academics are examples of achieving some mastery in those areas of strength for that child. Helping the child create a strong cultural identity might help. And helping the child develop relaxation techniques and conflict resolution strategies may also help. So looking at the family section, of course, positive relationships with any child giver or extended family members can help. But the catch here is that the victim is often isolated from friends and family. Looking at community, living in an area where access to basic services can help meet the basic needs. Advocacy and health issues is helpful. The community might provide role models and mentors like a coach or a faith leader. Having a positive and supportive school environment helps, certainly. And if a neighborhood is safe, perhaps it can offer support and connection. Something to consider in this is that risk factors for lower levels of resiliency include stressful life events, maternal depression, and income. An entrance into foster care in itself is a stressful life event. Promoting resilience is an intentional process that needs to occur over time and provide children with the skills and support to be able to heal and to move forward. It's done best with the involvement of a lot of village, with parents, families, therapists, and other members of a child support system. Examples of effort could be to provide opportunities for extracurricular involvement, show support through either presence or pride in their accomplishments, engage a family in religious or volunteer activities. Those are a few. All right, Kai's going to pick up now on additional strategies that promote helping children heal.
So we want to start with some other things, just some basic things that we can do in order to help children heal. Again, like I mentioned before, the behaviors we see in children are usually behaviors that they have seen themselves, and it's what's been imprinted on them. And one of the behaviors we hear a lot about is disrespect. So becoming loud and rude and disrespectful is sometimes an indication that people don't feel heard, and so that's been their way of being heard. So one, we want to be aware of their history. Take an opportunity to understand and read the background summary, recognizing what's behind, what have been some of their experiences, and then being willing to recognize that there are things that the child may disclose that was not a part of their history. Don't assume that what you see is what you get. Again, 10% of the iceberg is on top of those behaviors, and 90% is what's unknown. And a lot of times children disclose when they're in a safe and a comfortable environment, someone that they trust. Being aware of those behaviors, again, what they have been exposed to, whether it's been domestic violence, whether it's been, some traumatic experience, whether it's sexual assault or physical abuse, and then you yourself, taking time to gain that information regarding those behaviors. And then understand that it's not about us. It's not about you. A lot of times those behaviors are unrelated to current parenting, to current work that we're doing with the young people, if we're the clinician that's serving them. Children are wired to react and respond based on those experiences. We talked about just a little bit, how our traumatic experiences shape the brain, and through that shaping, they learn how to respond to experiences and events. And so they're pre-wired to react and respond based on those experiences. So a lot of times those reactions have little to do with what we're doing, but what they have learned, again, what they've been pre-wired to do. And this can, create some confusion and anxiety and frustration within us, as well as within the kid, because what we're presenting to them is different than what they've seen before, so they now have to unlearn some of those behaviors. And then earning the trust is a big piece, because, again, relationships are about that influence and being able to influence them and to impact them in a way to rewire their brain and those experiences so that they learn a different way of how to respond and how to interact with others. And helping them to feel safe, which goes right along with that trust. When we trust someone, we feel safe, we feel like we're able to try different things and to move into some unknown and uncharted territory. So being sensitive to, also there's tolerance for sounds and touch and using language and things that can help minimize their fear, and then seeking help as possible. There's always room for us to grow as well as the child. We want to take a minute just to look at what does it mean to look behind the behavior. We've mentioned that before. We've mentioned about the rewiring, taking time to really influence and to shift the work that we're doing in order to create some new experiences for the young person. So we've got Dominic here, and he refuses to go to his class and hides in the bathroom when a police officer comes to his school for Community Helpers Day. So in order to look behind the behavior, we want to do a couple of things. First, we want to think about what is going on with Dominic. Again, we could automatically kind of go into he's just being defiant, or maybe we could, think that he stole something, so he's afraid of the officer. Maybe it could be that, there was a situation of domestic violence with his mom's boyfriend, and the boyfriend was a, police officer or correctional officer. Again, but the key here is to stop and to take a moment to reflect on the situation, reflect on what's happening, and reflect on what could be going on with Dominic. The other piece that we want to ask is what may have been his triggers. We want to know, are there some cues, sensory, whether it's sight, sound, touch, that have triggered him, and to figure out, what those triggers are connected to. Again, trauma is stored at the most primal level, that state level of memory that we mentioned earlier. So what could be a very typical situation like the Community Officers Day could be a trigger for him. It could be sounds like the sound of a band. It could be smells, certain foods and scents. It could be textures. But the presence of this cop, again, if we take the scenario that maybe it was Dominic's mom was a victim of abuse and the boyfriend was a correctional officer, we could take that the sight of this officer, create a fear response, and him in his uniform, created that fear response, and he ran. So the next question we want to ask then is there a past trauma that helps us understand this better? We know trauma affects our ability to self-regulate, which means to stop, to pause, to do the things that we're asking, and I'm talking through now for us to do as professionals, but this impacts, trauma impacts a child's ability to do this, to stop, to take a breather, to figure out what's going on, and then to respond appropriately. It affects their ability to self-regulate, and complex trauma makes this task even more difficult because, again, like we said earlier, it's pervasive. It permeates every part of them, and so when that stress trigger goes off, we go into that fight, flight, or flee mode, and so we only know to react in the way that we have in previous situations where we've been scared, and that's either, again, to fight, to run, or to just to freeze, to disassociate. And so it also affects, again, that caregiver's ability to really form that attachment. And so this is our place to really help the child to regulate, to connect with the child, and then to be able to help them to move past and to hopefully rewire those experiences in order to create a new way of responding to threat. Some of the ways that we can do that to disarm that fear response is to make eye contact. Traumatic events impact the area of the brain that responds to threat. This area is called a fear response, like we mentioned, the fight, flight, or freeze. And in understanding these fear-related emotional, behavior, and cognitive patterns, can help us with our therapeutic interventions. And one of those is simply making that eye contact. Making eye contact helps us to connect with the child. It helps them to know they're safe. It lets them know that they have your attention and that you have yours. That they have your attention and you have theirs. Making eye contact, of course, is key for building attachment. And so you want to do things like the breathing exercises as well. Create some mirroring opportunities where you're breathing together, having that eye contact, allowing for that time for regulating, just to calm down and to de-escalate the situation, because that's the primary goal, is we want to de-escalate the situation and not intensify things, and that's where we want to go with that. We do have to be cautious of cultural nuances. We do want to be mindful of that. Just make sure we mention that, because eye contact can be different for each culture. So again, being aware of those cultural nuances as appropriate. Another way that we want to disarm the fear response is by giving choices and using simple language. We take the scenario with Dominic, who had ran into the restroom and kind of locked himself in, so to speak. The first bubble kind of gives us the option of, saying to Dominic, I can sit in here with you in the next stall until you calm down and you're ready to talk, or you can sit in here by yourself and I'll be outside the door. Again, this takes a shift on our part to not want to react and, pull him out the bathroom or force our way in, but to give him that minute to really have some level of control, to feel like he has some level of control, to give him some choices to help disarm that fear response, and that he feels less threatened, to let him know that he's safe, that this environment is safe, but giving him that option. The other thing that, when we're dealing with the games, that's always an issue of concern with parents, about doing homework and managing times on the games. 30 more minutes of Xbox and do your homework, or you can do the homework now and have an hour of Xbox, or whatever the new game system is. Again, it's about being able to allow them to have some control, to feel less threatening, to disarm the situation and not intensify it, and then using your words, just some simple phrases, simple language that we can use, such as no hurting or with respect, but ourselves modeling what that looks like, staying on task or focusing, to making sure that we're able to follow through with the task that's being given, and not using a lot of words with those tasks that we're given. Some other ones are, do you need a do-over? Instead of saying, did you do X, Y, and Z, and send the kid up, to lie or to fail, so to speak, but giving them the opportunity to have a do-over, and allow them to think through and provide a compromise for the situation. Again, not get into power struggles, not making the situation worse, but to diffuse it and to model what we want to see in young people. The other thing we want to spend a little time on is talking about earning a child's trust. Like we've mentioned before, change happens in relationships, and relationships happen with trust. Praising and giving emotional responses are critical, because kids need to know. We talked about some of those effects, and not having a sense of hope, not having a sense of worthiness, feeling like you can't trust the world, and why try? So building up their self-esteem and giving them those praise and emotional responses, so they're able to hear and process that they are worthy, they are good. Again, it's not that they're good, and it's just what has happened to them. Especially for that child who's played the role of the scapegoat, who's been the one that's been the reason why domestic violence has been happening, because he's been the quote-unquote bad kid. But making sure that our children understand, that they are worthy, and again, sharing those praises with them. Interacting playfully with your kid. Play is an international language. We all know play. We all do it, whether it's playing outside, or for some of us ladies, it's play therapy, i.e. shopping, shoes, clothes. Guys, it could be sports, but whatever that play looks like, with it interacting through play. And again, our young people could look different. It could look like the arts. It could look like sports. It could look like writing. The physically matching or mirroring, again, we talked about the eye contact and our tone of voice and how we say it. We were joking earlier, Deb used to teach CPI, and one of the things that she would talk about is, the comma placement in the sentences, and depending on where you read the comma and where you place it, the sentence could be very, very different depending on, how you read it. And so the same here is how we say things and the tone in which we say it and the message that we're getting across. And then being sensitive of tolerance for sounds and touch, those sensory issues, and then giving advance notice for upcoming changes. Because again, we want to show them that there's some predictability, there's stability, there's safety here, and that they can trust us. And that trust comes with them knowing that when they're transitioning, that they're not losing us, that it's not the situation where, cops are coming in to remove family from the home, but that they, again, have some sense of control in what's happening. And then respond attentively and kindly. One of the things I think that we all look for, and it's safe to say, is that we all want somebody who is present with us, who can spend that time, who can really just sit and be attentive to us, who's listening. We talked about, disrespect a lot of times because people don't feel heard. And so spending that time in order to hear our kids. There's a 10-20-10 formula, 10 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes after school, and 10 minutes at night, in order to spend that time with children, in order to really be with them, to be present with them. For clinicians, when we're doing our visits, whether it's counseling, whether it's case management, but to giving it time to just be attentive to them, to their needs, to their concerns, and to the things that they're dealing with, to show that we are here and we're really wanting to work with you on the things that that we've identified as areas that the kids are working towards progress and achieving those goals within. This slide here just really kind of reiterates for us that exposure to domestic violence can impact the way children see the world, but what we do with this knowledge makes a difference. What we do with this knowledge can impact their recovery and their healing. We simply address the behaviors and we miss the opportunity to really help children heal. If we take the time to respond instead of react and be present, if we model with our words and our actions, with the keeping it simple and helping them to identify and to work through basic feelings of sad, mad, scared, and happy, that's where we're able to make that impact. That's where we're able to make the difference in what's happening behind the scenes, looking behind the behavior to what's been imprinted on them, and to communicate to them that there's a different way, that there's alternate to what they may have seen in homes and in situations where they've been experienced and exposed to violence, but there is a different way. And so it's up to us to take that knowledge we have, that their exposure to domestic violence, their exposure to trauma has impacted them, and to use that knowledge to impact their recovery and their healing. That wraps up for us the training. We wanted to make sure we left a little time in order to ask some questions if you had some, as well as to leave information. Again, our website is listed if you'd like more information on APAC and its services, as well as the email addresses for Deb and myself. We'd love to hear from you all if you have questions or feedback for us, or any scenarios or things that you can share with us. We'd love to hear it from you.
Wonderful. Deb and Kai, thank you so much. I don't know that it doesn't look like we have any questions, but again, for those who are with us on the webinar, you see Deb and Kai's contact information. Feel free to drop them a line if you've got any feedback or questions for them. Thank you again for taking the time to present on such an important topic. As a reminder, all of the webinars have been recorded and are available on the Harmony website at www.harmonyfamilycenter.org. We ask that you plan to join us at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, February 10th for the next ASAP post-conference webinar entitled Because Finding a Home Isn't Enough, Creating a Model of Care that Creates and Sustains Families, which will be presented by Janice Goldwater, Founder and Executive Director of Adoption Together. Deb and Kai, thank you again. Until then, take care and have a great rest of the week.